I like to think of myself as a casual yarn dyer. I pretty much just dye for myself and my friends. I love the colors, and it is very satisfying to be able to dye my own yarn. About a year ago, I watched a Chemnitz tutorial on mixing colors and made a 12 color wheel of 10-gram mini skeins using just Deep Magenta, Bright Yellow, and Caribbean Blue, all from Dharma acid dyes. So today I want to dye this blue color for my sister who loves bright, rich blues. My favorite method for dyeing is what Rebecca at Chemnitz calls cold process or shoebox dyeing. I love it because it is a very low commitment. I can mix the colors, add the yarn, and then come back in a few days to steam set the yarn and then let it dry. So I have two 100-gram skeins of worsted weight yarn, 100% Superwash merino from yarn.com, and I'm going to dye them each in a plastic shoebox. First, I set them aside to soak in plain room temperature water while I mix the dyes. I want 1 gram of dye per 100 grams of yarn, which is a 1% depth of shade. And to get the shade of blue that I want, I need 0.75 grams of Caribbean Blue and 0.25 grams of Deep Magenta. I weighed enough dye for both shoe boxes, so I doubled the dye weights to 1.5 grams of Caribbean Blue and 0.5 grams of Deep Magenta. And then I mixed it with 300 milliliters of hot tap water to dissolve the dye and used a turkey baster to measure 150 milliliters in each shoebox. Next, I added the yarn, but I haven't added any citric acid yet. I don't want the dye to strike quickly. I want the yarn to absorb it slowly and evenly, and to pick up the dye for a couple of minutes first. Then I dissolve citric acid in hot tap water and add it to the dye bath. Finally, I cover the boxes and set them aside for a couple of days. And when I checked on them after about an hour or so, they were looking really good. The following day, I looked at them again in the morning and in the evening, and the water was just slightly blue. But overall, I was really happy with the color. To heat set the yarn, I fill a catering pan with water and just set a cooling rack inside the pan. This works really great for steaming, but I am starting to notice that the rack is getting a little bit rusty. If this happens, I suggest just cleaning it with a small brass brush. I picked this one up I think at Harbor Freight Tools. It was about $1, or you could use a Brillo pad or some steel wool. It removes enough of the rust that it doesn't get on the yarn, but honestly, if I didn't let the rack sit wet overnight, it probably wouldn't rust at all. So do whatever you want with that information. I let the water heat up just to a low simmer and then cover the pan with some tin foil for about 30 minutes. Then I let it sit overnight to completely cool. The next morning, I rinsed out the yarn and it was looking really, really good. There was the tiniest hint of blue in the water, which might have been from the Blue Dawn I was using. But as far as I'm concerned, this is absolute success. Then I put it in my dryer on the drain and spin option to spin out the extra water and let it dry. It usually takes about 24 to 48 hours for the yarn to completely dry. And then after that, I caked it up. But I noticed that there were knots in the yarn, which I had not seen before, which is, pretty annoying. So I'll deal with those as needed. I did show this yarn, however, to my sister and she loved it. So I'm taking the W on this one for sure. Next, I wanted to dye a set of 20-gram mini skeins for my friend Ashley, who last year bought a pack of rainbow sock minis, but told me she did not like the yarn base, so she never used them. I had some bare 20-gram minis for dyeing on a 75-25 sock base from Valley Yarns at yarn.com and decided to dye them Roy G Biv rainbow colors. So red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. I also had 3 100-gram skeins of 2-ply 80/20 merino sock yarn from Nomad Yarns that I set aside to soak. I wanted to dye one of these in Deep Magenta, then I was going to use the leftover dye on the remaining 2 skeins. Being that I want 1 gram of dye per 100 grams of yarn, also known as a 1% depth of shade, I'm going to mix 100 milliliters of hot tap water per gram of dye. I'm going to make 300 milliliter solution of Deep Magenta, a 200 milliliter solution of Brilliant Yellow, and a 200 milliliter solution of Caribbean Blue. Since I have 20-gram minis, to mix the colors I want, I have this chart. So for red, it will be 15 milliliters magenta, 5 milliliters yellow, 5 mils magenta, 15 yellow for orange. Yellow will just be straight 20 milliliters of yellow. Green is 15 milliliters of blue, 5 milliliters of yellow. Blue is just a straight 20 milliliters of blue. Indigo, 10 milliliters of blue, 10 milliliters of magenta, and then violet is 15 mils magenta, 5 mils of blue. And this adds up to 140 milliliters, which is also 140 grams. We have 7 20-gram mini skeins. And so this is why I mix 100 milliliters of water for each gram of dye. It's so I know how much dye is in a milliliter of water, because it really doesn't matter how much water you use. The amount of water at this stage is a tool for measuring the dye. I set up 7 containers and wrote the names of each color on the outside and then added water to each of them. Then I used a 30 milliliter syringe to measure the dye for each of the 7 minis, beginning with Deep Magenta, then I added the yellow, and then I added the blue. After I had all the dyes added, I gave each container a stir, and then I started adding the yarn. I haven't added any citric acid yet because I don't want the dye to strike too quickly. I want to give it a few minutes to try and absorb evenly before adding the acid. When all of the yarn was in its containers, I mixed a couple of tablespoons of citric acid with hot tap water and then added it to the containers. Then gave them all a good mix again and added their lids and set them aside for the next couple of days. Next, I took 100 milliliters of the Deep Magenta and added that to its own shoebox because I wanted to dye one of those skeins just a solid deep magenta. I didn't add any acid. I wanted the dye to strike slowly and evenly, and then I added a little bit of acid on top and thoroughly mixed it. Next, I wanted to use the leftover dye on the remaining 2 100-gram skeins of sock yarn. My plan was to add acid to the water first, then add the yarn, then pour in the dye, but not to touch or mix the dye in any way. By adding the acid to the water first, I hoped the dye would strike right away, even though I knew there'd still be some mixing. I was definitely a little surprised when I poured in the Deep Magenta first because the dye really started to travel to the other side of the container. And if you know why this happened, hang tight because it took me a minute to realize why that had happened. I let the Deep Magenta sit for about 10 minutes and then poured in the yellow and then the blue. And then this is when I realized, yeah, I had way too much water in the container, but I was still really pleased with what I was seeing. So I put the lid on and set everything aside for the next couple of days. So to heat set the yarn, I did the same thing I did with the blue yarn, which is that I just fill a catering pan with an inch or two of water and use the cooling rack. I like this because there's lots of room for each of the minis so they don't touch and there isn't any color transfer. I just get the water up to a nice simmer on medium heat and let it set for about 30 minutes. So while that was cooking, I got the Deep Magenta yarn ready, and I was really happy to see that the dye bath just had a little bit of pink left in the water. And I think for a 1% depth of shade and with this particular color, this is really good. I was happy with this result. I was also really looking forward to seeing our combo yarn and how much leftover dye there might be in that dye bath. And there was a lot. There was a lot of dye left over. which was surprising, but I guess also in hindsight, maybe not that surprising considering how much dye I was using and that it had no opportunity to get mixed in with the yarn, which is exactly what I wanted. That was the effect I wanted. But my gosh, it was so stunning. I got exactly what I was hoping for, which was some mixing to get like the greens, but also to have really distinct magenta, yellow, and blue sections, and also to have some white still peeking through, even in the sections that had the deeper rich colors, like especially in the blue. So I can tell even from looking at the yarn wet that this is just going to be great. When the minis were done cooking, I set them aside to cool so I could rinse them, and then I just went ahead and added the remaining magenta and combo color yarn to the pan to heat set. And I always get really nervous at this point when I need to rinse my yarn because I've in the past had literal bloodbaths because my yarn dye was not set well enough, but these turned out great. There might have been the slightest hint of blue, but overall this is absolute success. And again, I just put everything in my washing machine, drain and spin cycle to spin out the water, and then I let them hang up to dry for a day or two. The Deep Magenta still had the slightest amount of pink when I rinsed it, but I was still really happy with how this turned out. Overall, the color compared to the Rainbow Minis was much more even, and I think that's because the water level was much higher in the shoebox. And finally, I washed out the last two skeins and was so happy with how these colors turned out. There was some bleeding that was distinctly green, but considering how rich the blue and magenta and the yellow all were, I think this was acceptable, and I stopped after, a couple of rinses because sometimes hand-dyed yarn bleeds, and this, in my opinion, was a minimal amount of bleeding. So these all went into the washer to spin the water out, and then I hung them up to dry, and they were all completely dry in about 24 hours. I have to tell you, the camera doesn't do this yarn justice. The colors are so beautiful. I showed the Rainbow Minis to my friend Ashley. She loves them. She can't wait to get her hands on them. The Deep Magenta sock yarn is also for her. And of course, I love the combo yarn so much that I immediately cast on a new pair of socks, even though I already have several sock whips waiting to be finished. I started dyeing yarn a couple years ago, and I thought it was very challenging. It did not come easily to me, so I'm really glad that I stuck with it because I'm at a point now where I really enjoy the process and I'm really loving the results. If you enjoyed this video, please like or subscribe to the channel. I would love to have you. I love to knit, spin, crochet, and obviously dye. If you like more of that content, stick around. I'd love to have you. And yeah, I hope to see you in my next one. Bye-bye.